Hi everyone, I'm Igor and I'm gonna talk L2s today. We spoke a lot about different ways of decentralizing. It was all about the nodes, and I wanna go a little bit technical and philosophical here, and yeah, basically talk about ZK rollups. And first a little bit about me. In my pre-blockchain life, I used to run mobile browsers and then fintech at the browser company called Opera. Then for a while I've been a core dev in Ethereum. I was doing the Aragon client, and yeah, now I'm the CTO and co-founder of Gateway. And since we are not as famous yet as Infura, for instance, I'll have a couple of words about us. So we do quite a lot of things. We have RPC. We are kind of we support about like 10 networks, but we are kind of the provider for Gnosis, Luxo, and Stellar, where we actually work with the foundations to provide the whole necessary public infrastructure and public goods. We also do quite a lot of staking, again, partnering with the likes of Stakewise, Slido, and just vanilla. Presto is basically, right now it's essentially a rollup as a service that we're evolving towards to be like a platform as a service. And we do some core engineering efforts as well. Again, for Gnosis, I mean, there will be soon like ENS version for Gnosis, which we will provide infrastructure for. And we work on nodes for Polygon ZK EVM, and I mean, we just made Aragon work with Polygon ZK EVM, which brings the node diversity. I think the first node diversity for ZK rollups, essentially. I don't think there's any other ZK rollup that has more than one node implementation, which is, again, hope good news for everybody who runs infrastructure here. And based on that, I want to talk a little bit about, again, ZK rollups. And I have this thesis here that we're talking a lot about decentralization, but actually when you have ZK proofs and you run in ZK rollups, you kind of have quite a bit less pressure of decentralizing your rollup than if you run a layer 1 or an optimistic rollup or something like that. And I'll try to defend this thesis here a little bit. And yeah, it all started basically with, again, Presto. At some point, like in the beginning of the year, we started getting more and more requests to provision layers 2. And we started with optimistic stack, and then we slowly switched to, as soon as it was ready, first just a fork of Polygon ZK EVM, and then right now they release a Polygon CDK, so we had to switch to that. And basically we made a very nice provisioning UI when you can do a lot, like provision your own rollup very easily. And there's a lot of customizations if you want to, and that's kind of a good part. But all these rollups are centralized, right? Which is sort of a problem here. And even like basically what we provision is that. And I would say that maybe I'll try to defend that it's not as big of a problem as people might think with all this app chains and kind of centralization of sequencers and yada yada yada. So basically, if we look at the rollup that we provision, yeah, it has its own sequencer that we run, aggregator that we run, provers, nodes. It has a bridge built in, which is a really nice property of a rollup. And then it has states, it has synchronizer, some our components in purple, and then some third-party components. So this is like the whole environment that you get with Presto. And but if you look at, let's say, Polygon ZK EVM main, that's how it looks like. It looks like that roughly. So it's exactly the same setup. Apart, in this case, Polygon runs the sequencer, Polygon runs the provers, Polygon and some other parties can run the nodes, which is again the case for us as well. And there's certain load balancing happening, and there are some extra tooling there as well. So it's very, very similar. So what I will say here is like equally applies to both public instances of a rollup. Again, I know the most about Polygon ZK EVM, so I'll go in details on that. But I'm pretty sure that other ZK EVMs and other ZK rollups work in a roughly similar way. So a lot of this knowledge is actually can be transferred towards other rollups as well. I will not touch optimistic rollups in depth here because I'm not an expert. And again, and what I see that more and more of them playing with any kind of ZK proofs anyway, so we'll all get to some kind of a ZK rollups, I think, in the future. So if we look at a rollup in general from a very, very high level, we essentially have a root chain in purple here, which is usually Ethereum. And the rollup itself is in green, and it consists of two things. It essentially have some software and some blockchain you run, some, I don't know, processes essentially, and it has a set of smart contracts that are deployed to L1. And together they made a rollup. And these components, they are linked together with some kind of validity proof and data availability. And all the computation and everything is basically happening in L2, which is its own blockchain. And it's usually pretty centralized. And the goal there is usually to execute our transactions as quickly as possible. And then after that, through the communication on L1, somehow settle them on the layer 1. That's how the rollup looks like. And we'll start a little bit when talking about decentralization in particular. I would say that one of the important parts of decentralization lies like in the proofs for ZK rollups. And we will look at first on the regular blockchains, right? What's happening on the regular blockchains. One important property of the regular blockchains that happens is that they kind of provide a level playing field for everybody, right? They have certain set of rules on the blockchain, and these rules are the same for everybody who uses this blockchain, regardless of how much power you have, like, or whatever. It's basically, you can think about, there is a rule that your private key should be valid. There is a rule that you should have money for gas. There is a rule that you cannot spend more than a certain amount. And each opcode in EVM is also basically a rule. And these rules are the same for everybody. And how is it enforced? Basically, we have a lot of nodes. Everybody gets transaction. Everybody re-executes and needs to come to consensus, right? They need to come to the same result after re-executing transactions. And that's how they are enforced, because basically if your node for some reason altered some rules, then other nodes will just not get this transaction and will reject it as invalid, and things are nice. But consensus in here is a very critical part, because essentially what you want is to consensus to be as decentralized as possible. Because you have only one party that controls every node, then what you can do, you can alter these rules like however you want. You can censor transactions, you can include transactions that shouldn't work otherwise, and yada yada yada. So it's very, very important to have it purely decentralized. And what it means in reality, that your users, your like crypto degens or just normal users, they usually work with the blockchain through like two channels. One channel is obvious, is block producers. It could be validators, like miners before that. And another part is RPCs. And for consensus to really work well, to be protected, actually both of these parts needs to be quite a bit of decentralized. Because if one party can capture either one of them, I argue that's both are like equally bad for the security and the kind of agency of the users. For block producers, it's pretty obvious. Like if I control all the block producers, I can arbitrarily insert any like transaction, any state transition in the blockchain. But the same as RPCs. Let's say if our block producers are all nice and decentralized, but then RPC is like super captured, then nothing stops you from basically not allowing some valid blocks to sync into your RPC. So, and since users anyway usually talk to the RPCs, and if it's the only one RPC provider, then they are at its basically mercy. So this RPC can fork the node, just alter the rules, and they will be in the right here. So it's very, very important to protect the consensus, so it's distributed among like as many parties as possible. In terms of the layer 2, the schema is really similar. So layer 2 also brings kind of a level playing fields for everybody. But then these rules, instead of being enforced and re-executed by each node, they're essentially you as a you as an operator of the L2, you will have to provide a cryptographic proof for each of this rule that it wasn't broken for each state transition or each set of state transitions. And again, we use ZK proofs right now because that's the technology we have. But then this ZK proof, when it's generated, it also gets verified, but it gets verified on the layer 1. And that's a little bit of a key thing. So basically the verifier contract on the layer 1, it has knowledge of all these basically rules that every transactions have to, every transaction has to satisfy all these rules. And basically this verifier on L1 is the critical path. So in this case, since the verifier is on layer 1, basically you get security of the layer 1 and the properties of the layer 1s are getting inherited there, plus the governance of this smart contract, right? And that's why if you look at the current, a lot of ZK rollups, they have an extra governance on the verifier smart contract, which you cannot arbitrarily update without at least a time lock or something. Because then what's important also that's you talk to the L2 through a bridge, right? And this bridge, it actually uses data from the verifier smart contract on the layer 1 to decide on its own operations, right? To see that if the state transition was valid or not, and to basically unlock or not unlock funds. And the bridge is also doing it on layer 1. So that means that, again, if I'm a malicious operator of a layer 2, and if I'll try to alter those rules, so my proof will, unless I do something with the layer 1 smart contracts, I cannot alter the set of rules because the bridge will not accept them, and then the users will always be able to, either force include their transactions or force exit the rollup, which is a very important thing. So all of these things is basically bringing extra security and extra agency for the customers, but it's not done through decentralization like on the layer 1. It's done through actual mathematics of ZK proofs, and that the verification happens on the layer 1. That of course gives quite a bit of requirements about how good your layer 1 should be in this case, but about it a little bit later. And now we talk about, since we talked about altering the rules, what about just completely, removing the data, basically kind of a denial of service attacks there for users. And that's where data availability component is very important. Because if you want to call yourself a rollup, you need to send both proof and data availability to the layer 1. And essentially, if we, again, make a comparison between the layer 1s, like Ethereum and layers 2s, initially, data availability is basically protected, again, by decentralization. The more nodes, the more companies have. Every node has state of everything, state of the world. So that means that you cannot, again, alter the state or just remove parts of the state unless you have a supermajority of the nodes to come to consensus on this state. It's a little bit, becomes a little bit more muddy with 4444, 4844, full dunk sharding and all these things on the roadmap when data becomes semi-permanent. And that's why there are some interesting techniques like data availability sampling to know that enough node contains enough data about the state to actually not to be attacked on the data availability layer. On the L2s, it's again, L2s rely a lot on L1 in this as well. So basically, when you send your transaction to an L2, at first it only lives on the L2 for a while. It's usually a relatively short period, maybe minutes or something. So it gets sent and it gets sequenced and it's batched. In terms of the EVM, some don't batch, it doesn't really matter. And then the important part happens that it's getting sent to an L1. And since it's getting sent to L1, then regardless of what happens to this L2 in general, you can always recover the state directly from L1. the state of the rollup. So it doesn't really matter if your rollup leaves or not. You can always recover the state yourself. And then, of course, like in a while, there is a proofs that's also sent there, and then it's guarantees not about only the liveness of this data, but also about the security. And a special word about validiums here, or like to some extent what Vitalik thought, like was it yesterday about like kind of end game for Plasma or something. So basically, if we look at validiums, validium is different from the rollup is that it lacks this DA. It doesn't send DA to L1. Why is it done? It's mostly because it's cheaper. Like data availability cost, why Optimism burns so much ETH all the time, or Arbitrum burns so much ETH, or like Polygon ZKM, ZK Sync is mostly about data availability costs. They're pretty high. And that's why some people are basically running validiums. And again, in validium like this, on the picture, when you just don't send anything to layer 1, it's very naive validium. Then yeah, your data is not guaranteed by anything. The operator of this validium basically is the only custodian of this data. So if it decides to remove it, then your data is gone. Of course, there is an in-between solution, which is like Validium plus data availability committee or data availability layer, the likes of like Celestia that was recently launched, or like Near also told that they're going to participate in that, or maybe some other chains with a cheaper block space than Ethereum. And then it means that you still send proofs of things to L1, and then you send the data availability to a cheaper chain, essentially. And then it's a big question. Then you kind of rely on two chains. I don't want to even call them two parties. And both of these parties needs to be kind of good for you to have liveness and validity guarantees there. So basically, yeah, I think like what's important here is that these properties of security, these properties of agency, these properties of liveness, they don't really appear out of thin air. It just because you use the fancy cryptography, it doesn't mean that you have to like just ignore them, right? And they will, it's all be fine. In this case, this fancy cryptography, what it allows is to borrow this security and borrow this agency from the like a root chain, from the layer below. And that means that if your layer 1 is good, if it has like a massive validator set, it's well decentralized, then you have something to borrow. But if you have the best cryptography in the world, but your base layer is controlled by a single entity, or your root chain is controlled by a single entity, then like there's nothing you have nothing to borrow there. And that means that you are still be kind of in a bad space. So I think that in generally, if we're talking about decentralization, my point of view is that decentralization is a kind of it's a means to give users security and agency to keep your network neutral. And in case you can get a lot of this without kind of a proper decentralization, if for the layers 2, if your layer 1 is really, really good, and if you're using kind of a good cryptography. And that's roughly what I wanted to talk about. Again, it's a little bit of a deep dive on my thoughts on in generally ZK rollups and ZK rollups used as app chains. And I think that's it. So about yeah, basically any updates from Gateway, we have a Twitter. And again, if you want to try Presto, then here is the URL for you. And yeah, that's about it. So if you have any questions.